Hi, thanks so much for tuning in. You're watching BQ Prime, and this is Infravisioning, the show that gets you everything with regard to the infrastructure sector in this big, vast country that we're living in. Joining me, as always, is Vinayak Chatterjee, who is an expert in the infrastructure space and also the managing trustee at the Infravisioning Foundation. Thank you so much, Vinayak, as always, for taking the time. And the subject that we've chosen for today has to do with a column that you wrote recently about the transmission space in India. And you've spoken about four legs of the power sector in India. And you've spoken about the fact that transmission kind of, slips under the radar. It's not talked about very often. So let's start with the context. This is a massive country and we are widely connected by the transmission grid. What can you tell us about the way that this is developed?
So that's a nice way to start, Alex, because, as you rightly said, the electricity sector stands on four legs. It's a stool with four legs. And of these four, we have enormous discussion on generation, including green energy and all that. We have enormous distribution on transmission. We have enormous discussion on the fuels like coal and how is coal doing and how's renewables doing. That's the supply side. However, a very, very important link is what is called transmission, which very few people notice when you drive across the countryside or when you look outside your window of a train and you see these pylons and you see these wires hanging at a height. You don't give them a second glance. They're part of the landscape. So this, funnily enough, this vital leg of the power sector is broadly assumed to be quietly doing its job. But the important thing is that it has seen vast changes in the last few decades. And something that all of us Indians should be proud of is that India's power transmission grid is now recognized to be one of the best globally. It has become the largest synchronous interconnected electricity grid in the world, bigger than Europe, bigger than US, with 471,000 circuit kilometers as on January 2023. More importantly, as India became independent, as over the decades we were developing, India had pockets of regional grid. So there was the northeastern grid and there was the southern grid, and they didn't talk to each other. So you could have had a surplus in eastern India, which could not easily be transmitted to southern India because the grids neither talked to each other and nor were the pipes kind of fully interconnected. Luckily, as of December 31st, as recent, almost a decade earlier, 2013, all the regional grids were merged into one synchronous national grid. And as a nation, we were able to proudly proclaim one nation, one grid, one frequency. That's a very major development, even by world standards. But over to you, Alex.
No, so that I think lays the context, but the headline and the reason why we chose to talk about this is that you state that there is need for a level playing field in the transmission business in India. And that implies, Vinayak, that there is no level playing field right now. Why do you say that?
So that's true. I mean, in fact, I argue with the fact that the transmission sector now needs a level playing field, which obviously, as you so nicely put, implies that there isn't a level playing field. And there isn't. Industry players will agree that there isn't a level playing field. But let's look at how this system operated. Historically, we had a state monopoly. It was called Power Grid Corporation, which by all accounts did a great job. It was the sole developer of interregional and interstate transmission lines and is honestly acknowledged to have done a great job, a great service to the nation. But they were awarded projects on a platter. To string lines across the countryside is a fairly capex intensive activity, and Power Grid got these projects on nomination with margins and costs that they themselves imputed or put forward, which is popularly believed not to have greatly been challenged. So they could operate as a monopoly, first by getting all the jobs, and secondly at margins which they themselves determined for themselves. So now what happened thereafter is that the Indian policymakers in the power sector decided, and that is well represented in the Electricity Act 2003, was to promote private sector participation across all links in the energy chain. And therefore, even transmission was thrown open thereafter to the private sector. So by January, while the Electricity Act was passed in 2003, it is only after a series of moves that it was around January 2011, about 7-8 years later, once the policy was announced, that the formal processes of inviting the power sector to become developers in the process of building transmission lines, that kicked in by January 2011. So we are really talking now for about 12 years of that activity happening. And the method was called, in short, TBCB, which is the short form of tariff-based competitive bidding. So that brought, so broadly, the 2003 Electricity Act set the stage by saying private players have to be brought in. And from January 2011, Power Grid ceased to be a monopoly in the development and implementation of new transmission lines. And therefore, we see that, since January 2011, when this privatization happened, till 2023, out of the total circuit kilometers that India has in transmission lines, 38% is with the center, 54% is with the states, and happily, with this beginning, in the first decade of the new policy, 8% is with the private sector. So if this has happened, why do we say that it's still not a level playing field? Point number one is that Power Grid is still the beneficiary of having projects delivered to them by nomination, or to put it crudely, on a platter, where the government thinks there are strategic importance, or there are special reasons for giving it to them under the old method, that they can determine their margins and they can get on with it. And that is called, broadly in the industry, it's called the RTM, Regulated Tariff Mechanism. So point number one is that Power Grid still has a preeminent position where it enjoys the benefit of getting jobs from the government by nomination. Now, if one takes a look at why would I say the situation is serious about a non-level playing field? If I look at this period from January 2011 to 2023, of all the bids that were won, Power Grid won on competitive bidding 39%, and private sector won the balance 61%, which is not bad at all. 61% of the bids were won by private sector, and they include players like Sterlite, Renew Power, Resurgent, Apraava, GR Infra, Adani, etc. So private sector did win 61% of all the tariff-based competitive bids. But in the last 2 years, strangely, Power Grid increased its share of winning from the 39 that I'm sharing now in the last few years to 57%. So instead of gradually moving backwards to becoming a landlord, a facilitator, an overseer of the sector, Power Grid has actually in the last few years increased its bidding percentage from a decadic 37% to the last few years 57%. Now that is a worrying trend.
But Vinayak, that so just to come in here, if we're talking about 57% of winning bids in the last few years in a competitive process, in a bidding process, right? Wouldn't that imply that the bids are simply better than the private sector?
Yes, but how is it? So the question therefore to ask is, private sector is enthusiastic. It has a competitive streak. People are bidding against each other. How is it that Power Grid increases its stake from a decadic 37 to 39 to 57 in the last few years? Obviously, it has certain advantages in its armory, which allows it to bid cheaper, because obviously it is winning because its bid is the cheapest.
So, right? But are those uncompetitive?
Yes, and the industry would like to believe that the level playing field is uncompetitive, and I'll give you 3 reasons for it.
Okay.
First, Power Grid had a core team responsible for fresh planning of transmission lines even before privatization. This team historically constituted what is called the Central Transmission Utility, CTU. Once the TBCB came into force, a piquant situation arose. PGCL was privy to sensitive and critical information about up upcoming power transmission bids, leading to the view that Power Grid had an unfair advantage over other private players in that it got a ringside view of confidential data even before the bids were announced. In fact, it could even influence the decisions through CTUIL about which bids to put up for privatization and which to take on nomination basis. CTUIL, which I said is a central transmission utility, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Power Grid. So now that is something which is not fair. You can't have a wholly owned subsidiary which on paper gives the impression that it is distanced from Power Grid itself, the parent. But CTUIL is privy to all sensitive information, pre-bids, and for the upcoming projects. Now that's something that needs to be avoided in future. Point number 2, industry believes that Power Grid is able to quote low prices because it is a 100% Sarkari owned outfit and it has access to multilateral funding, which is at interest rates far lower than what Indian industry can get from the market. So it has an unfair price of capital advantage and allows it to build lower. But another important reason is that Power Grid exploits its dual identity role. Now, what is its dual identity role? Dual identity is that it gets bids by nomination from the government. The second part of the identity is that it competes with the private sector. Now, if you get a large bid from the government at a margin which is much fatter than what competitive bidding will allow you, so you make those fat margins in bids which you get by nomination, and you use those fat margins to cross-subsidize competition or competitive bids when you're competing with the private sector. Now, let's take the case of a recent case. A 27,000 crore transmission system was handed over to Power Grid from Ladakh to Kaithal in Haryana to basically evacuate renewable power from Ladakh. Good idea, but it was given by nomination to Power Grid, and some would argue that, well, it was strategic. Now, the Ladakh area to my mind is strategic, but coming to the plains of Haryana to my mind is far less strategic than bringing it down from Ladakh. But anyway, the jury is out. We really don't have the exact costing figures because they're confidential. But the jury is out that Power Grid would make fat margins on this 27,000 crore new project that it has been awarded on a platter from Ladakh to Kaithal, 27,000 crores. It could then have the wherewithal to outcompete private sector in the next competitive bid. Now, this really is what is an issue, Alex. It is not only bedeviling. While I'm using Power Grid to talk about a non-level playing field in transmission, it has to be understood that this is a problem that bedevils many sectors in infrastructure where the state historically has been a 100% player, and it is slowly opening up to the private sector.
Yeah. So you've mentioned Coal India.
So it has happened in the power generation sector also, where people have complained that BHEL was, or NTPC was in an unfair situation because they were getting jobs by nomination, whether to set up a power plant or to supply the equipment.
So what now, then? Okay, so yeah. Point taken, Vinayak. This is certainly something that requires a little bit of work, but by the data that you've shared, seemingly, incrementally, the private sector has been getting a bigger share. It can be argued that they can do a lot more. What then is the solution in this context? How should policy formulation, because you can't have the government suddenly say that strategic areas will be open to bidding. That rationale is very clear. You need to have border areas transmission that has to go to an organization that is controlled effectively by the government, right? So what is the solution?
Look, the government has to make up its mind that once it takes a policy decision to involve the private sector, right, then broadly it should move to a situation where state-owned PSUs should not be in the bidding game at all. I mean, imagine a situation where NHAI starts bidding for its own road projects. I mean, can you think of that? No. Now, similar situation, by the way, exists in the defense sector. It exists in the shipbuilding sector, where private shipbuilders compete with Mazgaon and Cochin Shipyard and others. So it's a problem that's prevalent in an economy where traditionally some activities have been 100% with the government, and government then invites private sector to come in, but also in a sense allows the incumbent PSU to not only be some kind of a special player in that sector, often get jobs by nomination and then compete with the private sector. So I think the policy direction should be that if you have decided as the people of this country to allow private sector to come in, then either the existing PSUs should be completely or partially privatized with no special benefits, or they should be prevented from bidding. Now, and this is a cross-sectoral issue, while today's discussion highlights transmission, but let me add that it is only illustrative of a rather more deeper malaise in policy that needs to be rectified. And in this context, Alex, let me just say that one of the most important judgments that came in, and as recently as June 15th, 2023. So I'm talking about a month-old judgment by the Supreme Court that after much verbal dueling between two sets of lawyers, Supreme Court firmly passed its opinion or a judgment that Coal India Limited, another public monopoly, was subject or has to come in within the ambit of the Competition Act. Till now, PSUs thought that they were outside the Competition Commission and the Competition Act. But the Supreme Court judgment, 1 month old, has set the cat amongst the pigeons to say that no, a PSU can also come under the Competition Commission purview. And basically in the Competition Commission, there are two pillars on which you can be accused. One is collusive behavior, where you set prices in collusion with other players. The other, in this case, the more relevant one, is called abuse of dominance. Now, if PSUs are going to be given special favors that allows them to abuse their dominant power in bidding situations or in similar situations, well, now the Supreme Court has opined that you can come in under the Competition Commission. So there is a lot of flutter in the PSU saying, so how is it going to affect their lives? So in the months ahead, I suppose we need another discussion to see where all this is going.
Certainly. And I think the most important point, Vinayak, can correct me if I'm wrong, has to do with how to manage areas of strategic importance or lines that are falling in areas of strategic importance. And I think if you resolve that one point and then figure out how everything else under the competitive bidding process gets assigned, that I think would be the solution that perhaps we're looking forward to. But this still is a point that I think required quite a bit of discourse, and I'm glad that we've set things off with this conversation. Thanks, as always, for taking the time and for speaking to us.
Pleasure, Alex. And watch this space. This is a policy framework which Indian industry is watching very, very carefully across sectors. And I did mention a few other sectors too.
Absolutely. All right. So there's lots to think about, and you'll find a lot more just like this on the website bqprime.com. So don't forget to check it out. Thanks for watching.